Or he came out of the conference room because he heard his son's voice go quiet. And a father learns over enough years that quiet is the sound worth listening for. The lobby of Hartley and Vance was the kind of room that had been designed to make certain people feel small. Dark wood paneling, oil portraits of founding partners stretching back 4 generations. A reception desk of black granite that put the person behind it 6 inches above the person in front. Everything in it spoke the same old language. "You are here because we permitted it." Daniel Mercer had never particularly noticed. He had been coming here for 3 years on the business of several $100 million of legal work, and the room had done what all rooms eventually did for Daniel Mercer, receded into the background while he focused on what actually mattered. What mattered right now was his son standing in the center of that lobby with 10 international clients, 2 senior partners, and 3 associates arranged or around him, and Richard Hartley's voice still hanging in the air like something that had already done its damage and was simply waiting to be acknowledged. Daniel crossed the lobby. He went down on one knee in front of Sam, his 11-year-old son, who was very still in the way he got still when he was managing something too large for the room, and he looked at his face and took the measure of it quietly. The way he took the measure of everything completely, and then with a decision already or forming, he stood. He looked at Richard Hartley, who was smiling, the smile of a man who had not yet understood that the temperature of the room had changed. And he said 4 words, "We're done here, Richard." Then he put his hand on Sam's shoulder, and they walked to the elevator together, and the doors closed behind them, and the lobby of Hartley and Vance received the silence they left behind, the way a room receives a verdict completely and all at once. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, every or active legal matter Daniel Mercer had entrusted to Hartley and Vance, 3 separate cases totaling $412 million in ongoing work, had been transferred out. By morning, the legal community had begun to hear something had happened, though none of them knew precisely what. Richard Hartley spent 48 hours trying to find out. What he found when he finally found it was not what he expected. It was never what they expected. Daniel Mercer drove a pickup truck that, or was 8 years old and ran without complaint, which he considered its finest quality. He wore work boots most days, not because he needed to. Company employed 1,100 people across 4 divisions, and he had not personally operated a piece of heavy equipment in 6 years. But because they were the shoes he had always worn, and because the men and women on his crews wore them, and he had a long-standing suspicion of the kind of executive who dressed for the room he was standing in, or rather than the work he was doing, he owned 3 good suits. He wore them to funerals, and to the rare occasions when the other party to a negotiation needed the visual confirmation that he could afford to be there. Otherwise, he dressed simply the way a man dresses when he has nothing to prove to strangers. Mercer Land and Development had started as a single parcel, 40 acres on the eastern edge of Claiborne County, that Daniel had bought at 26 with every dollar he had saved across, or 4 years of working his grandfather's construction crew, plus a bank loan that had required 3 attempts and a cosigner to obtain. The 40 acres had become a development. The development had become 2. The 2 had become a company. The company 16 years later managed the largest private land portfolio in the state, over 200,000 acres across 7 counties, with active commercial and residential development projects that had in the previous fiscal year, or revenues that required a team of accountants to fully enumerate. Very few people knew the scale of it. Daniel had preferred it that way since the beginning for reasons that had started as practical and had become over time something closer to philosophical. He had watched what happened to people when wealth became the most visible thing about them. The way it filtered every room they entered and every relationship they formed until they could no longer be certain whether a thing was true or simply performing truth at them. He had decided early that he would not let it do that to him, and he had kept the decision with the same stubborn consistency that had built the company in the first place. Elise had loved that about him. She had said once, during the 3rd year of the company when the money had first become significant, that she had married a man who would always be more interested in the thing itself than in what the thing said about him, and that she intended to make sure or their son inherited the same quality. Elise had died 20 months ago, 41 years old. Ovarian cancer, the specific cruelty of a disease that announces itself late and moves fast. She had spent the last 4 months of her life with the particular clarity of someone who has been told the timeline and has decided to use it rather than mourn it. And what she had used it for almost entirely was Sam reading with him, walking with him, telling him things she wanted him to know before she or could no longer say them. One evening, 2 weeks before the end, she had asked Daniel to sit with her after Sam had gone to bed. She had taken his hand. Her voice was still entirely hers, clear and direct. The voice of a woman who had grown up in old money and had spent her adult life deciding which parts of it to keep and which to discard. There are going to be people, she said, who look at Sam and see the clothes he's wearing instead of the person wearing them. People who decide what he's or worth before he's opened his mouth. I grew up surrounded by those people. I know exactly what they sound like. She looked at him with eyes that had never once in 18 years been anything other than completely honest. Don't let him grow up believing that their assessment is information. It isn't. It's just noise from people who don't know how to see? He had held her hand and promised. The way you promise someone the thing they need to hear and also happen to believe entirely, he had kept or the promise in every way he knew how. And on a Thursday afternoon, in the lobby of a law firm with oil portraits on the walls and a black granite reception desk, a man named Richard Hartley had handed him the occasion to keep it in the most visible way of all. Sam was 11 years old, and he read the way some children played sports with total physical commitment. The rest of the world gone entirely while the book was open. He read at breakfast and in the car and in waiting rooms and on the OR sidelines of his own soccer matches during halftime when the other boys were eating orange slices and talking about video games. He had been told twice by a concerned teacher that reading during halftime was perhaps antisocial. He had considered this and concluded that he was not opposed to being social, but that there were 35 pages left and he would catch up with people afterward. Daniel had not told him to be any different. He was Elise's son as much as Daniel's, and Elise had always, or read the same way. Their mornings had the quality of a thing practiced until it became effortless. Daniel was up at 5:30, not because the company required it, but because the early hour had a quality of thinking that the rest of the day crowded out. He made coffee. He reviewed the previous day's operational reports. When Sam came downstairs at 7 o'clock, Daniel closed the laptop and made breakfast, and they ate together with the easy quiet of people who did not need to perform being together or because they simply were. Sam had questions the way the sky had weather constantly in varying intensities and not always at predictable moments. He asked about the legal system and how land rights worked and what happened to a development project if the soil turned out to have a problem, and whether it was true that you could own the mineral rights to a piece of land separately from the surface rights. Daniel answered all of them. He answered them the way Elise had answered his questions when or he was young, seriously, completely without the condescension that turns a child's curiosity into something they learn to keep to themselves. 3 weeks before the Thursday at H. Hartley and Vance, Sam had said at dinner, "Dad, do lawyers work for you or do you work for them?" Daniel had set down his fork. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you pay them," Sam said. "So technically you're the employer, but they talk like they're doing you a favor." "Which one is it?" Daniel had looked at his son for a long moment. Then he had picked his fork back up and said, "That is exactly the right question. And the honest answer is that some of them have forgotten which one it is." Sam had nodded and gone back to his dinner, satisfied, the way he always was, when an answer confirmed rather than replaced what he had already understood. Richard Hartley had built Hartley and Vance over 32 years into something his grandfather, a county clerk who had put Richard through his first year of law school on, or a personal loan, would not have entirely recognized, and which Richard had long since stopped being able to see clearly. The way you stop seeing the furniture in a room you have lived in for 3 decades. He was 61, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the easy authority of a man who had been the most credentialed person in most rooms for a very long time. He wore his suits the way the firm wore its reputation as something that had been earned and was now simply owed to him by the world. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent 32 years in rooms where a certain kind of presentation was the price of admission, and who had gradually come to mistake the price of admission for the value of the room. Mercer Land and Development had come to the firm 3 years ago through a referral from a mutual contact, a real estate transaction that required specialized land use counsel. Richard had taken the meeting himself, expecting the kind of client the file suggested, or private, substantial, probably the inheritor of something. He had been surprised by the man who sat across his desk, plain clothes, work boots, the kind of handshake that came from actual physical work. He had recalibrated without showing it the way he had learned to recalibrate over 32 years, and the meeting had proceeded. Daniel Mercer had been in the 3 years since one of the most valuable clients the firm carried. Not the most demanding, he was almost entirely undemanding, or which was itself unusual at his level. Not the most visible, he attended meetings when required, and declined every invitation to firm events which was unusual and faintly baffling, but the most consistent. He paid on time. He trusted the work, and the work he brought was the kind that a firm built reputations on. Complex, significant, and repeatable. 3 active matters were currently running. The Eastfield Corridor land acquisition, a commercial development spanning 3 counties with their zoning complications that had required 18 months of regulatory work and were approaching resolution. An estate matter involving a land trust that Elise had established before she died, which Daniel had asked the firm to formalize and protect, and a municipal dispute in Harding County where a development permit had been improperly denied and which the firm's litigation team had been preparing for trial. Combined value of the ongoing work, $412 million. Thursday's meeting was a strategy session on the Eastfield matter, the final push before resolution. Richard had arranged it in the firm's main conference room, the large one with the east-facing windows and the view of the river. He had asked his senior land partner to attend and 2 associates. He had prepared thoroughly because he always prepared thoroughly, and because the Eastfield matter was the kind of resolution he wanted to be in the room for when it closed. He had not been told about the Orr boy until Daniel's assistant called that morning to say that Sam's school hay half-day and that Daniel would be bringing him and that he would wait in the lobby. Richard had said fine, a child in a lobby was not a consideration that required his attention. He had moved on. He would not move on from the consequences for a very long time. Clarissa had been an associate at Hartley and Vance for 14 months, and she had learned in those 14 months that there were two ways to survive a firm of this type. You could learn to be invisible, or you could learn to be useful in ways that the people above you had not thought to ask for. She had chosen the second. It was harder and less comfortable, and it had cost her 2 performance review conversations she would have preferred not to have had. But it had also produced a quality of work that the partners who paid attention had begun to notice, and the partners who paid attention were not always the loudest ones in the room. She was 27. She had grown up in a household where money was discussed as a practical matter rather than a social one. Her father was an engineer. Her mother ran a small accounting practice, and she had arrived at Hartley and Vance without the specific form of myopia that some of her colleagues had brought from backgrounds where the price of a suit was a signal worth reading. She saw people before she saw their presentation. It was not a quality the firm had trained into her. It was one she had arrived with and had been careful in 14 months not to lose. She had been assigned to the Eastfield matter 6 months ago. In 6 months, she had met Daniel Mercer 4 times. Each time she had noticed the same things. The work boots, the plain jacket, the quality of attention he gave to every person in the room, regardless of their title, and the way he asked questions that suggested he had read the documents more carefully than most of the lawyers who had written them. She had also, noticed from a comment made in passing during the second meeting, that the Mercer land portfolio was considerably larger than what the Eastfield matter represented. She had looked it up that evening. She had sat with what she found for a long time. She had not said anything about it to anyone. It was not her information to use, but she had filed it the way she filed everything that seemed important in the part of her mind where facts sat until they became relevant. On Thursday morning, Daniel's assistant called to say Sam would be waiting in the lobby. Claire had been the one who went to make sure the boy had water and a comfortable chair. She had brought him the book she had finished the previous week, a history of American land law that she had thought he might find interesting based on nothing except the look of a child who read seriously and might appreciate being treated as such. Sam had looked at the book, looked at her and said, "Is this actually good, or are you just, or being nice?" She had laughed both, she said, but mostly good. He had opened it. She had gone back to work. She had been at her desk for 40 minutes when she heard Richard's voice in the lobby and understood in the specific way of someone whose instinct for relevance is well developed that the facts she had been carrying for 6 months were about to become very relevant indeed. The delegation from Brennan Capital arrived at 2,158 partners from their London office, and 2 were from Singapore, representing one of the European private equity firms Hartley and Vance had been cultivating for 3 years. Richard had arranged a facilities tour before their 4 o'clock meeting, a walk through the firm's floors, the library, the main conference suite, the kind of thing that was not about the spaces themselves, but about what the spaces communicated. Richard moved through this kind of performance the way he moved through all performances easily with the practiced warmth of, or a man who had been at the front of rooms for 3 decades and had long since stopped distinguishing between the genuine version of himself and the version he deployed for important visitors. He led the delegation through the elevator bank, through the 44th floor library, through the conference suite with its river views, and then down to the main lobby for the exit. He came through the lobby doors with 10 international clients behind him, a senior partner to his left, 2 associates trailing, and the firm's full professional presentation arranged across his face, and he saw the boy. Sam was in the chair beside the reception desk where Claire had placed him, the book open across his knees, absorbed. He was wearing his school clothes, a plain collared shirt, dark trousers, the kind of clothes a boy wears on a school half-day that are neat without being formal. He was sitting with his feet flat on the floor and his back straight because his father had not raised a child who, or slouched, and he was reading with the complete focus he brought to everything he read. He had not heard them come in. He was 11 pages from the end of the chapter. Richard saw the boy and felt the specific irritation of a man whose carefully composed frame has been interrupted by something that does not belong in it. He turned toward the reception desk with the smooth directional authority that 32 years of managing rooms had made second nature. "Whose child is this?" The receptionist looked up. She knew perfectly well whose child it was. She had confirmed the arrangement that morning, but something in the quality of Richard's voice in front of 10 international clients produced in her the familiar paralysis of a person caught between a true answer and an authoritative manner.